The storm raged over the Sinaloa sky as alarms began to blare in the maximum security prison known as El Aullido, the Howl. Guards ran back and forth, confused. Surveillance cameras flickered. In the control tower, an officer shouted, "Inmate missing from the north wing! Old man Ortega has disappeared!" But no one believed it. How could a 78-year-old man with a fragile body, a hunched back and a gaze that barely lifted from the floor, have vanished? What the officers didn't know, what no one suspected, is that Julian Ortega, that silent and seemingly harmless old man, possessed an IQ over 500, documented by the Navy years ago. He had designed security and evasion systems for military prisons for over 3 decades, and now that same genius was locked up for a crime he didn't commit, a victim of a conspiracy born in the heart of the country's most feared cartel, Los Lobos del Norte, the Northern Wolves. But that night, everything would change. This is the story of how an old man, despised for his age and forgotten by the system, used his mind as his only weapon to defy the narcos, humiliate his captors, and execute the most impossible escape ever recorded. And if you think it all ends there, you're very wrong. Stick around until the end, because what you're about to discover could change the way you see the power of the human mind. And if you haven't already, subscribe. You won't want to miss how this old man becomes a legend. The prison of El Aullido wasn't just any place. It was a concrete and steel labyrinth, a punishment for the most dangerous, the unreformable, those whom the government considered impossible to contain anywhere else. For a man like Julian Ortega, an old man with a quiet gaze and slow steps, that prison should have been his tomb. But Julian's life had never been governed by conventional rules. At first, the other prisoners ignored him. What could such an old, frail man do, surrounded by violent criminals, hitmen and thieves of all kinds? His cell was small, an unadorned room, just an iron bed, a rickety table, and a small window where sunlight barely entered. The guards, seeing him, just dismissed him, seeing him as just another cog in the machine of a prison that seemed eternal. But Julian wasn't an ordinary prisoner. His mind was a labyrinth of calculations and analysis. It had always been that way. Before being imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, he was one of the country's most outstanding military engineers. His work on escape and security systems was recognized worldwide, although few knew of his exceptional abilities. The Wolves cartel, Los Lobos del Norte, had brought him here, not only for his knowledge but because he represented a threat to their interests. The day he arrived at El Aullido, Julian wasn't scared or desperate. He observed. He analyzed every corner. He listened to the sound of the guards' footsteps, the murmur of the inmates, the camera system, the schedule of the rounds, the flaws in the electrical system. Everything was a puzzle to be solved. And as the days passed, he realized something crucial. The prison wasn't as secure as everyone thought. Of course, the other prisoners knew nothing of this. For them, Julian was simply another old man in search of an improbable escape, a wish they only fueled in their dreams. But Julian knew that his only escape wasn't in the body but in the mind. And although his physique no longer responded, his brain was still as sharp as in his younger years. That day, while the other inmates were busy with their own problems, Julian decided to take the first step. He didn't need a special tool or a perfect plan. He just needed an out-of-service electricity generator, a generator that no one bothered to repair. With an imperturbable calm, he approached the checkpoint where the electrical system began to fail every few days. The guards looked at him without paying much attention, as if he were an invisible being. But in his mind, everything was clear. The old engineer was beginning to work not with hands but with the precision of his intellect. In a matter of hours, Julian had done the unthinkable. He restored the generator, adjusted the electrical connections and let the system work again. At first, the guards thought it was pure chance, but after a few hours they realized what had happened. The generator was working perfectly, without problems, without failures. The old man was doing what no other prisoner could. When the news spread among the inmates, some began to look at him differently. The old man, who had initially been dismissed by everyone, began to gain a strange reputation. Not for his age, but for the way he had shown that he wasn't as finished as everyone thought. Julian Ortega was proving that the human mind could be much more dangerous than any physical force. And now, without anyone knowing, his plan was beginning to take shape. As the days passed in El Aullido, the perception of the other prisoners about Julian Ortega slowly changed. At first, everyone thought he was just an older man, with a body worn out by the passage of time, dragging himself through the corridors without a clear purpose. But there was something different about him, something they couldn't identify. Meanwhile, the news of the generator repair spread quickly, not only among the prisoners, but also among the guards. That man had achieved what many considered impossible. The prison's electrical system was vital to keeping everything under control. And yet, Julian had fixed it without making noise, without attracting attention. The guards began to pay more attention to him. Captain Mario Salcedo, head of prison surveillance, decided to investigate him more closely. "Who taught you to do that, old man?" Salcedo asked with a challenging tone when he found Julian in his cell sitting by the window. Julian looked at him without haste, as if the question was insignificant. His face was covered in deep wrinkles, but his eyes, despite the years, maintained an impressive lucidity. "I learned it in the army, sir," Julian replied without emotion. The captain, a man with cold eyes and a stern face, frowned. Something in Julian's tone seemed out of place. No one in the prison had ever seen an inmate so calm and serene before authority. Salcedo, accustomed to intimidation, didn't know how to handle someone like him. He decided that the best thing to do would be to watch him closely. That night, the cartel leader inside the prison, El Víbora, the Viper, found out about Julian's feat. El Víbora, a burly man with tattoos covering his entire face and body, had control of the main activities inside El Aullido. No one dared to challenge him, much less someone like Julian. "Who is that old man?" El Víbora asked, as he watched Julian's figure walking down the hallway through the bars of his cell. "An engineer, it seems," one of his lieutenants replied. "He fixed the generator without anyone asking him to." El Víbora smiled with a cruel grin. He was used to prisoners fearing him, but Julian showed no fear. "I want to know everything about him. Bring him to me. If he's as smart as they say, he could be useful. Or even better, we can make him work for us." El Víbora already saw Julian as another piece in his game, although he didn't yet know how dangerous he could be. On the other hand, Julian was aware of what was cooking. Throughout the days, he had heard murmurs about El Víbora, his cruel regime, and the way he controlled the prison. Although the other prisoners were afraid to talk about him, Julian never missed a detail. He had a knack for listening, for capturing what others didn't perceive. He knew that his survival depended on his ability to keep his identity and his abilities safe. But not all was lost for Julian. In the following days, Tomás el Gordo, the fat man, a man of robust build and a kind face, approached him. Tomás had been a cartel accountant before being caught and imprisoned. Since entering El Aullido, he had tried to stay away from the dirty business of others, but fear kept him in check. "Listen, old man," Tomás said, slowly approaching Julian's cell. "I know you're not an ordinary prisoner. All the others here are trapped in this place because of our bad decisions, but you have something else, something the others don't have." Julian looked at him, showing no surprise. He knew that sooner or later someone would come looking for his help. The word had spread like wildfire among the inmates. Julian's mind was not common, and that was starting to attract attention. "What do you want, Tomás?" Julian asked in a low voice, his gaze fixed on the man. "I want to get out of here too," Tomás replied, with desperation in his eyes. "And I think you're the only way to do it." Julian smiled softly. It wasn't the first time someone had sought him out for his ingenuity, but this time something was different. Maybe this time the plan would be bigger, riskier. But Julian Ortega wasn't afraid of risk. He knew that in the end, the greatest challenge was always the mind, not the bars. As Julian Ortega adapted to life in El Aullido, his mind never stopped working. Each day he analyzed the prison more and more, unraveling its secrets. The routine of the guards, the surveillance cameras, the narrow corridors, the unprotected windows. Everything was part of a puzzle that he was beginning to solve piece by piece. Meanwhile, the rumors about his ability multiplied among the inmates. Some feared him, Others saw him as an enigma, but few knew what was really happening in his mind. Julian wasn't just learning about the prison, he was creating an invisible map of the entire complex, a map that only he could understand. One afternoon, while the guards were making their usual rounds, Julian went to his cell and began to draw on the floor with a piece of charcoal. With quick and precise lines, he traced the outline of the prison, marking the locations of the cameras, the blind spots, the locked doors, the unguarded corridors. It was a mental map turned into a drawing that, for others, made no sense. But for him, each line represented a route, a possible exit. Tomas, the cartel accountant, watched from the door of the cell, intrigued by Julian's calm. He knew that something big was brewing, but he had no idea how deep his partner's plan was. "What are you doing?" Tomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julian looked up, his eyes shining with a dangerous intelligence. "I'm plotting a route," he replied without saying more. El Gordo, as the other prisoners called him, frowned. He didn't fully understand, but he could see that the old man wasn't playing games. His mind had already drawn more than a simple escape. He had found the weakness of El Aulido. Each day, Julian spent hours perfecting his map. He knew that the prison was not only a physical labyrinth, but also a psychological one. The guards, the Narcos, everyone was trapped in their own system. And while they clung to their control, Julian looked for a way to tear down those invisible walls that limited his freedom. The next stage of his plan was crucial. He had to build a network of allies. He couldn't escape alone, not without exposing others to unnecessary danger. Although his efforts so far hadn't been perceived as a threat, Julian knew that at some point, someone would discover what he was doing. And at that moment, he would need the others to survive. The next morning, while in the prison yard, Julian approached Miguel El Coyote, an inmate who had been a truck driver for the cartel and who, according to rumors, had contacts with the outside world. "Miguel," Julian began in a grave voice, "I need to talk to you." El Coyote, a middle-aged man with a face weathered by the sun, looked at him sideways, as if evaluating Julian's intentions. Prisoners didn't usually talk to each other without a hidden motive. "What do you want, old man?" Miguel replied, crossing his arms. Julian offered him a calm smile, the same one he had used so many times in his life as an engineer. "You know how everything works here, and I know how to escape. But I can't do it alone." Miguel stared at him for a long moment. He knew that Julian wasn't just any man, but he still doubted. "And why should I trust you?" he asked distrustfully. Julian didn't answer immediately. He just looked him in the eyes, with the same calm that had accompanied him throughout his life. "Because you have no other choice. We are all trapped in the same place, and only if we work together can we get out. But if you keep refusing, you will die here like everyone else." Miguel studied Julian, perceiving a bitter truth in his words. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. What do you need from me?" Julian smiled, knowing that he had managed to take the first step in his plan. El Coyote was now part of his network. Little by little, the pieces were beginning to fit together. That night, Julian returned to his cell and drew a final line on his mental map. It was no longer just a place of escape. It was a plan, a detailed strategy to liberate not only him, but those who, like him, had been forgotten by the world. He knew that the truth of his plan would be revealed soon, but nothing could stop him now. The escape had begun. The days began to turn into weeks inside El Aulido, but for Julian Ortega, each of them was marked by silent but steady progress. His escape plan wasn't based on physical strength or violence, but on something much more dangerous: his mind. The old engineer had created more than a map. He had devised a series of steps and measures that were beginning to take shape inside the prison. From the first moment he understood the flaws in the system, he began to apply small changes, each one calculated with precision. He knew that if he wanted to escape, he had to be patient, but he also knew that patience had a limit. His time inside El Aulido was about to run out. A morning while Julian was eating breakfast in the dining hall, he was approached by El Vibora, the prison's feared cartel leader. He'd heard rumors that Julian was a strange man, unlike the other prisoners. Although the old man had managed to go unnoticed until now, El Víbora felt that something wasn't right. No one came to the howl without leaving a mark, and Julian was starting to leave his. "Hey, old man," El Víbora said, approaching with his heavy gait. "I hear you're good with your hands. You don't see much of that around here." Julian looked at him calmly. He knew El Víbora was testing him, but his face remained serene. "I just do my job, nothing more," Julian replied, showing no emotion. El Víbora smiled disdainfully. His cold, calculating eyes scanned Julian's figure, looking for any sign of weakness. "Listen, old man, if you're so smart, maybe you can help me. I've heard the prison's security systems are a mess. Would you like to be useful, maybe in a more productive way?" The old man didn't answer immediately. He knew what El Víbora was suggesting. Prisoners, especially the intelligent ones, were valuable resources for the cartel. But Julian wasn't stupid. He couldn't trust a man like El Víbora, a ruthless killer who had left his mark on every corner of the howl. "And what do you offer in return?" Julian asked calmly, raising an eyebrow as if it were a simple business transaction. El Víbora stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low, cruel laugh. "I offer you protection, old man, and the opportunity to gain some comfort in this place. No one will hurt you, and you'll have access to the resources you need." Julian didn't hesitate in his response. El Víbora watched him, waiting for a reaction, but the old man didn't yield. However, inside, Julian was plotting his next move. He couldn't accept the offer, but he also knew that rejecting it meant putting himself in the sights of El Víbora and his cartel. "I don't need comfort, friend. I just need time. And believe me, I have all the time in the world," Julian replied, remaining calm. El Víbora frowned. Something inside him knew that the old man had more than just a survival plan. Despite his apparent weakness, Julian wasn't just any prisoner. The intelligence he possessed was a much greater danger than anything else he could offer. With a final look of disdain, El Víbora turned and walked away, leaving Julian with his mind racing. He knew he had to stay under the radar, but he also understood that the pieces of his escape were beginning to fall into place. That night, as all the inmates retreated to their cells, Julian began to review his mental map again. The escape wouldn't be easy. He needed more allies, more resources, and above all, more time. El Víbora's plan had been a veiled threat, but Julian couldn't afford distractions. Every step he took was carefully calculated. He knew that the next stage of his plan should involve Padre Ignacio, the prison chaplain, a man who seemed to have more information about what was really happening in the howl. Although he wasn't sure of the priest's loyalty, he didn't have many options. The next day, while most of the prisoners attended Mass, Julian approached Padre Ignacio. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. "Father, I need to talk to you," Julian said, his voice low and serene. The priest looked at him, surprised by the request, but nodded. "Of course, Julian, what's wrong?" Julian gave him a fixed, thoughtful look. "I think it's time this place stopped being a prison for me, and I want you to help me." Padre Ignacio said nothing. He just watched him, as if he already knew what the old man was referring to. The tension in the howl began to rise as the days grew longer. The surveillance system, although efficient, had flaws that Julian had begun to identify with precision. Each of those flaws became an opportunity for him. However, there was something he didn't expect: increased surveillance by El Víbora. Not only was his presence more constant, but now he had his men closely watching all movements within the prison. Julian knew he had to act quickly. His mental map was almost complete, but something was still missing. Although he had begun to forge a network of allies, Tomás el Gordo and Miguel el Coyote remained his main allies, but the danger of being discovered was latent. He needed more support, someone who could help him within the darkest corners of the howl, someone who had access to resources that others could not. It was then that Padre Ignacio decided to intervene. After weeks of observation and caution, the priest approached Julian with an offer that would change the course of his plan. "Julian," the priest said in a whisper as they walked down the dark hallway, "I've been watching your movements. I know what you're planning. And while I must admit I don't fully understand why you're risking escape, you've shown me something very valuable: your faith in what you can achieve." Julian looked at him without saying anything. Padre Ignacio seemed to have a deep understanding of the situation, something Julian hadn't anticipated. In his youth, he had had faith in the system, but that system had betrayed him. Now, in his prison, faith was a complex idea that he didn't know how to interpret. However, he was willing to accept the priest's help. He needed all the allies he could get. "I don't have faith in the system, Father," Julian replied seriously, "but I do have faith in what I'm capable of doing. I need you to help me, and I promise you it will be for the best for all of us." The priest nodded slowly, as if he understood everything. He knew that what Julian was looking for was not only physical freedom, but also a way to redeem what had happened to his life. "I can get you something very valuable," Padre Ignacio said in a low voice. "I have contacts outside the prison. I can get a part of your plan to the outside, but you must understand that this will not be easy. No one can know what we are doing. If something goes wrong, we will all pay the price." Julian nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He couldn't fail. He knew that prison was not only a physical place, but also a state of mind, a psychological control that he had to challenge if he wanted to survive. Meanwhile, tensions inside the howl continued to grow. El Vibora had begun to doubt Julian, and his men were beginning to patrol more closely the area where the old engineer spent most of his time. Every step he took, every action he took, was being watched. But Julian was not intimidated. He knew that time was running out, but he also knew that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. That night, after talking to Padre Ignacio, Julian gathered Tomas and Miguel, his two closest allies, to plot the next step. The plan was taking shape, but there were still many details to resolve. "This is getting more complicated," Tomas said, looking at the two men. "El Vibora is not a fool. He's starting to suspect you, Julian." "I know," Julian replied calmly. "But the only way this works is to keep going. Patience is the key. We just need a little margin of time." Miguel, who had been silent until then, intervened with an obvious concern. "And what if we get caught? If we discover the plan, who's going to help us? I don't trust the other inmates. Here, no one gives anything without asking for something in return." Julian stared at him, understanding his fears. He knew that the howl was not a place where you could trust anyone, but he also knew that Padre Ignacio was a crucial piece to ensure the success of the plan. And if everything went well, the escape would not only save Julian, but many others who lived trapped within the prison walls. "We are not alone," Julian replied. "If we do it right, Padre Ignacio will take care of the external contacts, and when the time comes, the opportunity to escape will be ours. We will all get out of here." The conversation continued late into the night. There was a lot at stake, but Julian felt that the first step for his escape was near. The next few days would be decisive. The pieces of the puzzle were lining up, and the howl was beginning to feel more vulnerable than ever. The atmosphere inside the howl was changing, but not in the way everyone expected. While the cartel of Los Lobos del Norte increased surveillance on the most intelligent inmates, including Julian and his allies, the old engineer not only remained calm, but his mind worked with a speed and precision that frightened even the most feared prisoners. Julian had reached a critical point. The plan was taking shape, but the increasing pressure from El Vibora and his men was beginning to expose the cracks in the system. The days of calm were numbered, and the danger of being discovered became more tangible with every move. However, Julian trusted that the human mind was his greatest ally. Although his body was slowing down with age, his ability to analyze and process information remained as sharp as in his days as a military engineer. That night, as the prison fell into an unsettling silence, Julian met with Tomas and Miguel in the inner courtyard. No one should know they were plotting. The contact with the outside, thanks to Padre Ignacio, had given them hope, but it had also increased the pressure on them. Time was running out. "El Vibora is suspecting me," Julian said in a low voice, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Tonight, we have to move. I've noticed that the camera system has a flaw in the south zone near the supply warehouse. If we manage to get there, we can take what we need for the escape." Tomas looked around, making sure no one was listening to them. He knew the risk was enormous, But he also understood that there was no turning back. If they remained silent, they would die there. It was now or never. But what if someone else sees something? Miguel asked with palpable concern. If El Víbora discovers us, then we will have to do everything possible so that they don't discover us, Julian interrupted without hesitation. The escape won't be easy, but it's our only option. Despite the gravity of the situation, Julian felt calm. There was a certainty within him. He had faced impossible situations before. The war, the conspiracies, the most lethal enemies. None of that had managed to break him. The labyrinth of his mind was much more structured than the howl itself. The next day, Julian began to plot his next move. Using the knowledge he had acquired of the flaws in the surveillance system, he began to create distractions in different parts of the prison. He began to manipulate the cells, causing the light systems to flicker or go out, creating moments of confusion. He knew that, just like in a game of chess, he needed to make everyone move according to his plan. However, what Julian had not anticipated was El Víbora's move. The cartel leader had begun to feel more uncomfortable with Julian's calmness. He wanted answers, and he wasn't going to wait any longer. That same afternoon, he summoned Julian to his cell. "I've been watching you, old man," El Víbora said, his face impassive. "You're not as stupid as the others. All your movements are calculated. What are you planning?" Julian remained calm as he always did. He knew that any show of fear would be his end. However, he had to respond in a way that wouldn't arouse more suspicion. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Julian replied, keeping his tone serene. "I'm just trying to adapt to this place, like everyone else." El Víbora stared at him, but said nothing. He knew he was being cautious, but he also had the feeling that something was happening in the howl. And Julian Ortega, the old man who had remained invisible for so long, was beginning to become a threat. Upon leaving El Víbora's cell, Julian didn't stop to think. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating the probabilities, plotting new routes. He knew that the time for distraction was coming to an end. He had to prepare the escape before the cartel took the next step. That night, he headed again to the south zone of the prison, where the surveillance cameras were not working properly. Miguel and Tomás followed him closely. El Gordo seemed more nervous than ever, but Julian trusted that, despite the tensions, everything would go as planned. With each step, the pressure increased. El Víbora would soon discover the truth, but Julian was already prepared. The human mind for him was the true labyrinth that he had to cross. And while the howl watched him from the shadows, he had already begun to escape, without anyone knowing. The night in the howl was permeated by the dampness of fear. Julian Ortega had felt that pressure many times before. In the wars he fought as a military engineer, but never like this. The tension could be cut with a knife. The movements he made, every step he took, were being watched more closely than ever. El Víbora had marked him as a threat. He knew that the escape strategies he had devised were working, but the price of his success was about to be high. El Víbora would not sit idly by much longer. The alarms in his mind, as sharp as ever, told him that he should accelerate his plan. That night in the prison courtyard, Julian gathered Tomás, Miguel, and Padre Ignacio. The four men knew that this was the crucial moment. The surveillance system had flaws, yes, but security had also increased in key points. However, there was something that Julian had managed to identify. Every time the cameras failed in an area, it was only for a few minutes, enough time to execute a decisive plan. "We have to go to the supply warehouse. El Víbora doesn't know that I have already made a complete map of the area. If we manage to get in there, we can take what we need for the escape," Julian said, pointing to his mental map, which he had already transferred to a piece of paper. The routes, the cameras, the blind spots. Everything was plotted with inhuman precision. Okay, here's the text translated into American English, adjusted for YouTube video suitability. Tomás, though fearful, showed resolve. Gordo had lived his life outside the law, but never this close to a real escape. Prison had marked everyone, but Julian had done the unthinkable, kept his cool and gotten others to follow him. "We know what we have to do, Julian," Tomás said, looking at the others. The words felt heavier than usual. Fear hung in the air, thick enough to cut. But Miguel next to him nodded, understanding they only had a chance if they stuck together. Julian watched them silently, knowing the next move was dangerous but necessary. Breaking out wasn't just a physical challenge, it was about patience, mental strategy, and seeing options no one else did. First things first, Julian said, drawing lines on the ground with a piece of charcoal. We need the cameras in the south zone down for at least 3 minutes. And while that's happening, we have to make sure the guards are nowhere near. If we pull that off, we can grab the supplies and get out undetected. Father Ignacio looked at them, his face showing the worry of a man of faith trapped in a violent world, but his voice was clear and calm. Julian, I'm with you. I've spoken to some contacts outside. They have intel on an escape tunnel, but it won't be easy. You'll need a serious distraction to get out without being chased. This isn't just about running. There's a lot at stake. Julian nodded, appreciating the priest's words. Father Ignacio had been moving pieces outside of the howl, though he couldn't guarantee success. Still, he trusted him. After all, the escape plan wasn't just about getting out, but making the prison itself vulnerable, something they could only do together. The next step was tricky. They needed to distract the Viper, and that meant Julian getting directly involved. He'd learned that the best way to deal with the cartels was to use their own methods. He knew the Viper was too confident in his own power. If he could shake him up a bit, plant a seed of doubt, the whole thing would start to crumble. I'm going to create a distraction, Julian said with a quick smile. The Viper doesn't know I've already manipulated him into walking into his own trap. Tomas looked confused. Julian was talking like a military strategist. Everything seemed so calculated, so precise. It was like every word was designed to put the cartel boss in an awkward, vulnerable position. How are you going to do that? Miguel asked, still suspicious. We'll do it the only way the Viper understands, Julian replied, his eyes gleaming with determination. He thinks I'm just some old man shuffling through the halls, but in this chess game, I'm the one moving the pieces. Gordo and Coyote looked at each other, unsure if Julian's plan had any chance of working. But something in his eyes told them this man, the old man they'd underestimated, wasn't like the others. He had more than just smarts. He could see the prison as an extension of his own mind. Every security flaw was an opportunity. As the conversation went on, the decision was clear. Confronting the Viper and his men was unavoidable, but like on a chessboard, Julian's moves were already planned. There was no room for doubt. The escape was on. The moment was approaching, and with it, the pressure. Uncertainty filled the halls of the howl, but Julian Ortega remained calm, as if it were all part of a game. The plan he'd been working on for weeks with mathematical precision was about to climax. The escape operation, carefully structured in his mind, couldn't be stopped. But, as in any confrontation, the last move was the most crucial. That night, as moonlight barely filtered through the prison cracks, Julian met once more with Tomas, Miguel, and Father Ignacio. This would be their last council before the big move. The time had come. This is the last time we meet before the escape, Julian said, looking at the three men. If everything goes right, tomorrow at this time, I'll be out of this prison, but we have to be precise. Tomas nodded, looking at his face full of uncertainty. Gordo had followed the plan to the letter, but there was something in the air he couldn't identify. The fleeting nature of time terrified him. Julian, what if something goes wrong? He asked, the tension evident in his voice. Nothing will go wrong, Julian replied confidently. Every step has been calculated. All we have to do now is execute what we've already planned. The distraction is ready, and the escape will happen in 3 phases. Disable the cameras, grab the supplies, and head to the escape tunnel Father Ignacio arranged. Father Ignacio, who until that moment had remained silent, spoke with a serenity only a man of faith could possess in such a desperate situation. Julian, what you're doing isn't just an escape, it's a liberation for many. Prison isn't just a physical space, it's a mental jail, and freeing ourselves from it is an act of faith in all of us. The priest's words resonated deeply in the hearts of the men present. It wasn't just about escaping, but transcending the prison they lived in, a prison of bodies and minds. It was an act of resistance, a rebellion seeking not only physical freedom, but spiritual freedom as well. The plan was set. At the right moment, Tomas would trigger the distraction, shutting off the lights in the south sector of the prison, where the cameras had systematic failures. Meanwhile, Miguel would ensure the path to the supply warehouse was clear of guards. Julian, at that moment, would use his technical knowledge to disable the final security system, opening the doors that would lead them directly to the escape tunnel Father Ignacio had provided. It all had to happen in less than 3 minutes. The last piece of the puzzle was the confrontation with the Viper. Julian knew he couldn't escape without directly facing the cartel boss. He knew that even if the Viper was focused on other matters, his intuition would lead him to Julian at the least expected moment. It won't be easy. But what happens after this is out of our hands, Julian said, with a fixed look in the eyes of the 3 men. No one else can intervene. We are all responsible for this plan and for what happens next. The tension was palpable. The 4 men knew that what was about to happen would change their lives forever, for better or worse. But despite the fear lurking in the air, something inside Julian told him it was time to act. The time for waiting was over. In the distance, the sound of guards patrolling the halls echoed. Julian and his allies moved silently, with millimeter precision. Gordo, despite his fears, stayed close, waiting for Julian's signal to proceed. Every step they took brought them closer to the exit door. There was no turning back. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening with a crash interrupted the silence. The Viper had arrived. He knew something was happening. Julian's eyes gleamed with determination. This was the final confrontation, the moment when all the pieces of the game would come together. However, Julian was not afraid. He had been calculating, relentless. He knew that what was to come would be the last play. There would be no other attempt. "It's now or never," Julian said in a grave voice as the sound of the Viper's boots approached rapidly. The 3 men nodded. With a final breath, Julian gave the signal. The tension was palpable in the air. Julian Ortega and his allies advanced through the tunnel towards freedom, but something didn't fit. The feeling that something was about to happen took hold of Julian. His steps were firm, but he knew that the confrontation with the Viper was not yet over. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the silence. The Viper appeared before them, like a shadow in the darkness, with his cold and defiant expression. The cartel boss had followed them. The escape they had planned so carefully was at risk. "I thought you had left me behind, old man," said the Viper, his tone full of contempt. Julian looked at him without flinching. "I will not leave without freeing what belongs to me," replied Julian, the calm in his voice like a sharp sword. The Viper pointed his gun at Julian, but at that very moment, Julian's ingenuity took control. He deflected the barrel with a quick movement, and with a slight push, the gun flew out of the Viper's hands. Tomas and Miguel reacted quickly, disarming the cartel member who was now completely vulnerable. The Viper looked at him, frustration and fear reflected on his face, but Julian did not see him as an enemy. He saw him as another piece on a board that he already dominated. Without saying a word, he turned towards the tunnel door, advancing towards his freedom. When they thought everything was resolved, an unexpected turn left Julian speechless. At the end of the tunnel, the Viper, apparently defeated, had disappeared. But in his place, a familiar figure appeared in the shadows. Father Ignacio. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. Surprise ran through his body like lightning. What was the priest doing there, and why hadn't he told them anything? "Father?" asked Julian, bewildered. Father Ignacio, with a serious face, raised a hand to calm him. "It's not what you think, Julian. I have been working for someone else outside the prison, and now, what we are doing, what you have done, has much greater implications." The priest took out a cell phone, something that shouldn't be there. Julian immediately understood that the escape was not only his. Someone else had been pulling the strings from the outside. "There is more at stake than you think. The Viper is not the only one who had plans. My mission was also to ensure that this escape was more than just an escape for you. There are many people involved, and now there is no turning back," said the priest, his tone grave. Julian felt the pressure increase. The revelation had left him bewildered. Now he was no longer just fleeing from a prison. He was trapped in a much larger network than he had imagined. But time was not on his side. The door to the outside was near, and he could not stop now. With the pieces of the puzzle changing rapidly, Julian realized that what seemed like a personal victory had transformed into something bigger. Father Ignacio, although he revealed his secrets, was also his guide to freedom. The priest had played a crucial role in all of this, albeit silently. Despite the uncertainty, freedom was just a few steps away. The tunnel led to the exit, but now the fight was not only against external forces, but against the forces that were manipulating the pieces of the board from the shadows. Julian could not deny the feeling of betrayal that arose, but at the same time his purpose remained intact. With the Viper out of the game and the path clear, Julian and his allies made the final decision. There was no time for more doubts. Father Ignacio guided them towards the tunnel with quick steps, and when they finally reached the door, they found themselves outside, under the freedom they so longed for. The prison was now nothing more than a memory, but the sacrifice of many still remained in their hearts. The escape had been successful, but Julian knew that the real fight had only just begun. Now free from physical chains, the old engineer faced an uncertain future, but with something more important than ever before: the ability to transform his destiny. And that, perhaps, was the greatest freedom he could obtain.